Hello there. So I'm not going to be in class to be able to do my part of the presentation. So I've screencasted this, the timeline. So I'm going to be introducing our presentation and kind of going in the broad overview of the history of the rights accused, kind of from its roots, kind of before the American Revolution up to the modern day. This is just an overhead again, so I'm going to be going very fast and just briefly talking about each of the cases and some of the important points. So let's get started. So prior to the American Revolution, there was a lot of kind of one of the main issues that was one of the main tensions between the American colonies and the British rulers was the colonies desired more autonomy, in part with their justice system, and resented the arbitrary justice of the British. And this included, like, there was immunity for corrupt and abusive officials. There was centralized British control of the British system and of the justice system, and so there was no trial by jury. And so essentially, Parliament could declare anyone guilty of a crime at will, and there were not really any legal way to combat that sentence. And so this was a problem that they faced before that, and was a leading cause of the American Revolution, which is here, which I don't really need to go into more detail on. We all know about that. However, the Declaration of Independence was important because it kind of enumerated a lot of the important points of the rights accused, like the broader themes, such as like equality under the law, kind of like all men are created equal in the preamble. Yeah, but the most important historical document relating to the rights accused is the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1789. And when it was ratified by all the states, actually it wasn't ratified until 92, I believe. But anyways, this is the basis of all the rights accused you have today, specifically the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Seventh, and the Eighth. And there's a whole list of rights here. We'll go into some of these more later, but they include like the protection from search and seizure, protection from double jeopardy, and right to due process, right to legal counsel, speedy public trial, right to trial by jury, protection from excessive bail and cruel or unusual punishment, etc. And what was interesting about the Bill of Rights is that it only applied to the states at first. And so that was actually the issue that was determined in Barron v. Baltimore. So the Barron v. Baltimore was not a court case that had to do with the rights of the accused. It had to do with the incorporation and kind of to what extent did the Bill of Rights apply to the states and to the federal government. And so the Supreme Court case ruled that in Barron v. Baltimore in 1833 that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. And this was important because it kind of set the tone for the conflict over the rights accused moving forward. Dred Scott versus Sanford, though not expressly related to the rights accused, the ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford that basically African Americans were not citizens essentially limited their rights to the accused. They couldn't petition in court, for example. They had no legal rights, like protection from double jeopardy was a big one too. And so that was a big problem, kind of moving forward. But then that was fixed only 11 years later with the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is very important in the history of the rights of the accused because it includes a due process clause. So in addition to basically like granting citizenship to all African Americans, therefore guaranteeing the rights of the accused under the Bill of Rights, they also had a due process clause, which is that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And this is very important kind of in the incorporation debate of the rights to the accused from the Bill of Rights to apply to the states in the future, which as we will see in just a little bit. So moving forward from that, we're going to jump forward in time up to Weeks versus United States. So this was the first kind of major case that involved the exclusionary rule, which is that any legally obtained evidence cannot be used in courts on basis of the Fourth Amendment protection from search and seizure. However, it was only limited to the federal courts and not incorporated to the states. That wasn't until later, about in 1963, in Mapp v. Ohio. So Powell v. Alabama, basically limited the rights, or not limited, partially incorporated the Sixth Amendment right to counsel by basically requiring states to provide legal counsel in cases of capital punishment. This was overturned later in Bretz v. Brady, where basically they ruled that the states did not have to do that. Brown v. Mississippi, an important case, it determined that basically any coerced confessions that were forced out by police violence, including that any confessions forced out of police violence, an involuntary confession, it cannot be entered as evidence into any court as it violates the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, as well as the right protection from self-incrimination. So Japanese internment camps, this is more of kind of a general thing that it's an interesting point in history where the United States government basically justified violating the rights of American citizens in favor of like the paranoia, or like kind of giving into the paranoia of that time right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. and many of the rights of the accused, including like the protection from search and seizure, um, protection against self-incrimination, et cetera, were basically violated. In Korematsu versus the United States in 1944, none of those violations were deemed unconstitutional because of the Espionage Act, even though there was no evidence that basically said that, yes, these Japanese Americans, like obviously not all of the Japanese Americans were spies or whatnot, and so that's an interesting blemish kind of on the history of the rights of the accused. Mapp v. Ohio is a very important case. In Mapp v. Ohio, basically it was established, Mapp, an Ohio resident, had been convicted based on evidence obtained from her home without a warrant. And so the exclusionary rule applied in Weeks only applied to federal courts. And so it was the legally seized evidence was still admissible in her trial in a state court. However, when she appealed to the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Mapp and via the 14th Amendment that provides equal coverage under the law, that states cannot limit that. That basically the exclusionary law became applicable to all states, which is important. Gideon v. Wainwright is an important case within which the same thing happened via the 14th Amendment. Basically, the right to legal counsel was incorporated, and so then states had to provide legal aid in all trials. It was a very important decision, unanimous decision. And this overturned the prior decision in Betts v. Brady. And Escobedo versus Illinois expanded on that by basically requiring that lawyers are present or have the rights for lawyers to be present during police interrogation and answering questions. Miranda v. Arizona is another very important court case. But what's interesting about this one is it kind of moves away from the theme of incorporation we've seen so far into kind of expanding the rights of the rights that are not directly stated in the Constitution, and also kind of describing the police and law enforcement role in the rights of the accused and the justice process. So the Supreme Court, Ernesto Miranda, basically been accused of kidnapping and raping an 18-year-old woman near Phoenix, and after several hours of police interrogation, Miranda signed a written confession. However, the police did not inform Miranda of any of his constitutional rights at any point during that questioning. And so the Supreme Court overturned Miranda's conviction upon appeal, basically declaring that the police must inform criminal suspects of their constitutional rights before questioning suspects after an arrest. And these are the Miranda rights. They include the famous ones like right to remain silent, right to stop answering questions at any time, right to a lawyer, etc., etc. So that's a very important case too. Furman v. Georgia basically put a moratorium on the death penalty in the United States via the Eighth Amendment, protection from unusual punishment. Cruel and unusual punishment. Gregg v. Georgia kind of overturned that and actually ruled that it could be used, that the death penalty was the correct punishment for certain crimes. So that's the United States versus Robinson is an interesting case because it essentially ruled that upon the arrest of a person, all containers and objects on that person can be used in a court of law as evidence, as the Fourth Amendment does not protect those objects. And this is an interesting debate because at the time, that didn't seem like much of an issue, right? Like, I mean, it was just, you had whatever was on you. However, now with the issue of smartphones having these, like, data mines essentially on us, that becomes much more of an issue as we look at more kind of current events coming up furthermore in this presentation. So, let's move forward. We don't have time to talk about either of these, but there are also interesting cases. Look them up. Smith v. Maryland. So this basically ruled that the United States versus Alvarez Machain essentially ruled that illegal aliens did not have the right of the Fourth Amendment, and that illegally obtained evidence could be used in a trial that involved a illegal immigrant here who does not have citizenship status. So that was just an interesting case that added on to previous decisions. The torture memos basically expanded upon or basically is possibly in violation of the Eighth Amendment, kind of cruel and unusual punishment. And this is a trickier one to talk about because it's not really known if they did it on U.S. citizens, because if they did, that'd be much more of a constitutional issue. But the sentiment within the Eighth Amendment protection from whether or not waterboarding after 9/11 essentially violated the Eighth Amendment because the military and CIA basically defined it as enhanced interrogation procedures in order to get around the torture word. So that's just in case where no legal prosecution was done following that case. And so we're gonna look. We got some current events up here, but we'll touch on more of these in a little bit. These kind of focus a lot more on the Fourth Amendment, actually. This is kind of one of the issues, and kind of the way that the data collected from smartphones applies the exclusionary rule and the rights to accuse. So that's it for this part of the presentation. We will move on.